This is the 966, episode 26. Richard Mabrouk.
Thank you.
Joining us today, a very, very special guest, Mr. David Rundell, author of the book Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. Look, if you want to understand Saudi Arabia, start with this book. We both think it's the best out there on the kingdom. So, David, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
David, it's truly an honor to have you with us today. We both feel like this, the book you wrote, Vision or Mirage, is the source, unparalleled source for understanding Saudi Arabia today and also in the past. So we're looking forward to our conversation today. And one of the things, David, I wanted to jump into is a really distinctive thing about your career. You spent 15 years in Saudi Arabia working at the embassy from top to bottom, and you were also in the consulates in Jeddah and Dhahran. You were in Riyadh. You were the chief of mission, charge d'affaires, deputy chief of mission, political counselor, economic counselor, commercial attaché, everything. And it's important to note, as I understand it,
ambassador's driver.
Yeah,
I was the ambassador's driver for a while too.
Is that right?
Not really, just a little bit.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me, but is this correct? This is an unrivaled record of single country concentration for an American diplomat, not only in Saudi Arabia, but in any country. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate. I'm not sure it's an accolade, but it's accurate.
Well, what an extraordinary opportunity. And didn't, as a young officer, wasn't one of your tasks to go out and sort of travel around the country and speak with people?
Yeah, the reason that it's unique set of assignments is, and probably will never be equaled, is because I was also the commercial attaché and the commercial counselor. And that really means you've got to actually leave the State Department and consciously go work for the Department of Commerce for several years. And I worked for them for 7 years before they made me the commercial counselor in Riyadh. So that's very unusual. So to have been the econ counselor, the political counselor, and the commercial counselor is pretty unheard of. So anyway, that's why I think no one else will ever do it, because they probably don't want to. In terms of what I did on my first tour, which really whetted my appetite for Saudi Arabia, was very shortly after the Shah of Iran had fallen, and we believed that we did not have an adequate information about what was happening inside the actual countryside, and that we'd focused too much on the capital. So they created a job, someone to go out and find out what was happening in the countryside. I was the most junior political officer. I was not married, and I was more than happy to spend 2 weeks out of every month traveling around Saudi Arabia in my Jeep. And that's what I did for 2 years. And to be honest, there were many days I would wake up and think, wow, they're actually paying me to do this, This is like a vacation, I'm really having a good time. I'm using my Arabic, I'm stopping in, it was very interesting, really, because everywhere I went, first person I went to see was the governor. I went to every single province in Saudi Arabia. I went to every city there was, and pretty much every place there was a paved road, and many places there weren't paved roads. And I slept in gas stations, and sometimes in sand dunes, and sometimes in palaces, and talked literally to everybody from, governors to shepherds. And so I learned a great deal. And I liked Saudi Arabia. I found it interesting. And at the end, I came back and I wrote my report, which said that I did not think there would be a revolution in Saudi Arabia in the next 5 years. I couldn't tell them what was going to happen in 20 years, but I certainly said I don't think there's going to be one in 5 years. And many people didn't like that. They all figured that the Shah had fallen and then the Al Saud were next. And so there's been a long drumbeat of people who believe that Saudi Arabia is unstable and is going to collapse. And they've been wrong repeatedly. They still publish books and they still write newspaper articles. In fact, I had a collection. It was kind of funny. I still have it somewhere. My collection of newspaper articles all the way back to the 1930s, predicting the collapse of the House of Saud. So I wish I had $1 for all those guys who've been wrong. And the whole premise of my book really was to reverse the question and to say, not when will the Al Saud collapse, but how come they're still here? How come they are the last strategically important monarchy in the world? There's a photograph of the funeral of King Edward of Great Britain in the early 1900s. And in the cortege behind his coffin are dozens of kings and emperors and sultans and archdukes and counts, and all of these people in plumed hats and bright coats with medals and sashes. And then at the very end of the parade, there's one guy in a black coat with a top hat, and that is President Roosevelt. And he's at the end of the parade because he is the only guy there who's not a king or a duke or a emperor. So you look at that picture, and then you stick that next to the latest meeting of the G20, and there's only one king left. And 100 years later, the whole table has turned. And so why is that? And I think the answer is answered in the book.
Before we get started, that was fascinating. Before we get started, I just want to share our appreciation to our listeners and viewers on all podcast platforms, YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts, you can find us there. Really cool, Richard, to see our viewership and listenership grow each week, which is just awesome, very motivating. Yeah. So we appreciate you all being here with us today. Richard, let's get started. What's your one big thing this week? Excuse me.
I like all my one big things, but I really like this one this week. So Saudi Arabia is conducting its very own Wilson Olympics. Growing up, every 4th of July, my parents would invite neighbors and friends to come over for hamburgers and hot dogs. And the much ballyhooed Wilson Olympics, which was really just a hodgepodge of games, some real, some made up. And for a kid, but also I think for the adults, it was a highlight of every summer and a source of bragging rights throughout the year. So it's really a fond memory, and it's a great idea. But similar to the Wilson Olympics, the 22 Saudi Games will take place from March 10th to 20th in Riyadh. Now, this is the first edition of this multi-sport competition overseen by the Saudi Arabian Olympic and Paralympic Committee, which is kind of cool. They're doing both of these together. More than 6,000 athletes are set to participate in 45 sports, which, this is the part I love, were selected on the basis of their popularity. So this is Wilson Olympics Redux. I don't have copyrights on this, but I think there was something going on here. The chosen sports are, and bear with me, are archery, athletics, badminton, 5-on-5 and 3-on-3 basketball. Lucien, we may want to consider this. Beach volleyball, billiards, bowling, boxing, camel racing, chess, road cycling, equestrian in the form of endurance jumping, electronic games, fencing, football, golf, gymnastics, handball, rowing, judo, jiu-jitsu, karate, kickboxing, Muay Thai boxing, shooting, sports climbing, skateboarding, squash, swimming, table tennis, taekwondo, tennis, triathlon, volleyball, water polo, weightlifting, wrestling, paddling, karting, sambo, aikido, wushu, and balut, which is a traditional card game, which I love. So again, this is by popular acclaim. These are the sports that are in the Saudi Games. Participating sports, they're holding preliminary competition round on February 16th with locals, amateurs, and professional athletes from Saudi Arabia, all eligible to compete. Another thing I love, so this is going off on March 10th. Anyone interested in participating has until February 13th to sign up. So, I mean, this is truly a games for the people. I mean, if you want to join in and sign up and compete, you can do it. Prize money is set to reach up to $26,000. The Wilson Olympics, I think, well, maybe it was an extra slice of watermelon.
Was smaller for the
yeah, sorry. And that watermelon was great in July. But opening ceremony take place at the King Fahd International Stadium in Riyadh. I love this. This is truly participation and joy of sports and just a great story.
That is a really cool story. David, please feel free to weigh in.
No, I disagree. I mean, it's another step in the right direction.
Yeah.
In the book, I tried to provide leading indicators as to where Saudi Arabia was going socially, economically, and politically. I don't claim that I have a crystal ball, so I can draw several possible scenarios and then put out indicators which would give you an idea as to which way things are going. I had a problem with that because every time I put one in, the Saudis would meet it.
Yeah.
And then it would be done. And I'd say, well, I better, women driving, well, tick that one off. Women lawyers, tick that one off. So I should have put this in. I didn't think of this. I didn't think of their own Wilson Olympics. So yeah, I think it's interesting in that it is different enough from the real Olympics to get attention. It's not just wannabe follow on to something that's already been done. It's a new and interesting idea. So
Yeah.
good for them.
And I think it's different too. Sorry to interrupt, Lucien. I think it's different too from some of the other marquee sports initiatives they've done, in golf and soccer and that sort of thing. But anyway,
that is exactly what I was going to say. I mean, Saudis are now seeing a Winter Olympian. They're seeing one or two go to the Summer Olympics, and there's a huge gulf between those Saudis and the Saudis that are on the global stage. I think that's something like this is really cool because it makes it. I am loath to use a word, but it makes it democratic. It makes it accessible. Like if you want to compete in these first Saudi games, you can as a Saudi. You just need to be a little bit popular among your friends. I just think that's a really cool story. Count me in for the next Wilson Olympics, by the way. I don't know what my specialty will be, but I want to be there. Especially if you're paying in watermelon. I'm in.
It's the watermelon is the coin of the realm. Yeah. We may include balut. First we have to learn how to play it, but that would be a good addition.
That's very popular in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I'm
it's
sure.
Widely played there. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of contestants for that.
What, if I may ask, what is it? Is it like it's like a card game, right?
Yes.
I've never played it. I've never learned how to play it. It seems to be something like bridge, but I don't really know. But it's played regularly. A lot of people play it.
My little understanding of it is it's akin to bridge, and I guess it was brought to the Hijaz by Indian immigrants during the Ottoman Empire, and it became very popular. But yes, obviously, if it was voted into the Saudi Games, it's clearly very popular.
That's awesome. Richard, if I may, I'll move on to my one big thing this week, and then we'll take advantage of David's really deep experience in Saudi Arabia. But I just wanted to share this report. It came out this week from the World Bank on the truly staggering annual costs of pollution in the Middle East. Air pollution alone costs the MENA region $141 billion a year. That's 2% of economic output. Some of the findings from the World Bank in this report, which was on our website, sustg.com, and we'll share it on our podcast website as well. Air pollution levels in the MENA's largest cities are among the highest in the world. The average citizen in these cities is breathing in air that is 10 times more polluted than the WHO says is safe. It causes 270,000 deaths a year, and the average MENA resident is sick at least 60 days in his or her lifetime due to exposure to elevated air pollution levels. So wow. The report sort of discusses different types of pollution, their impact on the economy, and then also society. And I think one thing that's really interesting about it, and again, I've got a lot of notes here, but I just want to make this point. I think the global dialogue on climate change has started really evolving, and it's started about 6 months ago. If you look online, there's a report actually from the Pew Research Center, so it's definitely there. A survey of attitudes of 17 countries found growing widespread concern about the personal impact of global climate change. And I think what we're seeing now from policymakers and stakeholders is a shift in how they're dealing with climate change, and they're presenting it more and more as an opportunity. And if you look at the Riyadh Green Initiative, which I think really kicked that off, was sort of the Saudis saying, hey, like, we now understand this is an opportunity, not just a bill that we're being presented regarding, our emissions. So I think rhetoric is changing on climate change. And I think the way that policymakers, stakeholders are approaching the problem is saying, look, there's really economic opportunity here. What this report does is sort of highlight the costs of not doing anything on the annual economy. So the World Bank report says, it recommends tackling air pollution, marine plastic pollution, coastal erosion, and emphasizes the 4 I's: inform stakeholders, provide incentives, strengthen institutions, and investment in abatement options. The last thing I'll mention about this, and we'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this, but really interesting, mangroves are getting a lot of attention. Richard Adams-Szyminski mentioned it to us, former president of CAPSARC, about the use of mangroves along coastal seas, and I think the Saudis are doing that along the Red Sea. So just an interesting report. Check it out. It's really cool. I thought that figure was staggering, frankly.
Can you help me understand the report, which I have not read? Does it state what the leading causes of this pollution are in any kind of ranked order?
Did you see that, Richard? I didn't see a lot on what these causes were.
It's a good question.
Nor did it break it down. I'm sorry. Nor did it break it down by country, which I thought was interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
So that makes, to be honest, I think that makes it a fairly useless report. To tell me something is MENA, I mean, what does that mean? That they have more pollution in Cairo than they do in Abu Dhabi? I mean, anything that is just MENA is kind of useless. It's the same way they used to do specifically, they used to say, how much, which country owns treasury bonds? And they would say, there's one number for the GCC,
right,
which they did on purpose to disguise it. Now they've actually started saying which country holds what. But, I think that something that is done just MENA is of questionable use. And the second thing I would say is, fine, there's so much pollution, but if I'm going to do something about it, tell me what the sources are. Mm-hmm. Is this mostly from motor transportation, or is it mostly from electricity generation? So I need to know that. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. Mm-hmm. Probably not what the author wants to hear, but that's what I would think.
I think two thoughts. One, based off of Lucien's. Actually, David, let me start with you. That MENA distinction is important because, as we're seeing, especially with things like the COVID pandemic, and in the region within itself, you really have to disaggregate it because increasingly it is becoming haves and have-nots. And
absolutely.
And so the MENA region, which, as you say, is not instructive in terms of understanding specific issues.
There's probably no geographic region in the world where the disparity between, Cairo again and Abu Dhabi, I mean, that's a huge distinction. Yeah. I mean, and I can't think of any two cities in Europe that are that far apart, or even really in Asia or Africa.
And just
it's a damaging way to look at it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but Lucien, I think Lucien. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say I don't mean to be critical of.
No.
I'm not being critical of Lucien. I think it's an interesting report to look at. But I'm being critical of the authors of the report. The idea of looking at that number is interesting. I just think that they could have done a better job.
Well, I think it speaks to one of the elements of going in discussion of an intelligent discussion of the global energy conversion, because certainly at times the pro alternative energy, renewable energy, clean energy, so it's presented as if you can just flip a switch, and you can't. And the residue of pollution in these lesser developed countries, emerging markets, I mean, that's a byproduct of not being able to address the sources. They don't have the funds or the means or the technology or the political willpower to address the sources of these pollution. And Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, the Ministry of Energy in Saudi Arabia, had an interview with Time recently where he pointed this out. And he said, look, 3 billion people lack any meaningful energy source, any clean energy just for cooking. These people use biomass, everything to burn, including cutting trees, just to get through the day. They expose themselves to all sorts of hazards, including sickness and even death, and of course generate enormous amounts of air pollution. So, understanding this is part and parcel, I think, to the fact that this, managing your air pollution and your emissions from many countries, it's impossible to be at the top of the list because first you have to feed your family. And it's a real challenge.
Well, you need to look at how they're producing electricity in different cities. I mean, if I had a long chat with some people from Tesla once about this. Again, I'm an economist by training, so I look at data in perhaps a little more skeptical way than some people do. But I said, tell me about what is the CO2 produced per mile driven? I mean, I see in the subway or the tube in London these signs saying, zero emissions from this electric car. I said, okay, zero emissions from your electric car, but electricity is not a source of energy. Electricity is a means of transferring energy.
Right.
The energy came from somewhere. So, and this guy was very honest. He said, you're right that depending on how the electricity is made, you could be actually producing more pollution driving a Tesla than you would driving a regular Chevrolet. And if in fact the electricity is produced by coal, that's almost certainly the case.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd have to look and see where the electricity, I don't know how they produce electricity in Cairo. So it's a complicated, as you were saying, Richard, it's a complicated question, and the answer is not as simple as a lot of people seem to think.
No, and just the production of an electric vehicle is highly energy intensive, and just getting the minerals and the lithium and things from the batteries is and often very emission intensive. So I think that's one of the good things that coming out of the discussion. I feel like in terms of the global energy conversion and the climate change discussion, especially coming out of COP26 in Glasgow in November, end of November, is becoming a little more well-rounded, not fully well-rounded, but a little more well-rounded.
Well, I think that Lucien made a good point, and the report makes a good point when it talks about the actual health impact that this has. Again, I don't know where they got their numbers or how they aggregated them, but clearly a significant number of people are having health problems as a result of this, and that's a wake-up call. That's more about health than it is about climate change, and that's a different issue. And we've been dealing with pollution as a health hazard, which is a separate issue really than climate change. But I think that the fact that they pointed that out is a good thing. Yeah, have you been to India when they are all burning their crops? If you have never seen anything like that. I couldn't believe it. You couldn't see 20 feet ahead of you, and you couldn't breathe. I mean, you literally, don't ever go to India at the time of year when they're burning their crops, because you will not have a pleasant experience. Anyway, and that just goes to what Richard was saying about how there's a lot of sources of this that come from primitive agriculture, people who don't have if they had another way to get rid of their crops, I guess, or their rubble, they would do it, their stubble.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, and the solutions here are not, turnkey solutions. Riyadh is planting what was the figure, Richard? 10 billion trees. It's a staggering number of trees.
Yeah,
but that's really true. I'm with a billion. I'd like to know where they're going to get a billion trees.
It's got to be a million. Doesn't have to be a million.
I've seen billion myself, and I just can't. I just know where you're going to get a billion trees.
I can't. Yeah,
but that's a decade plus solution. I think this is also going to serve as the impetus for some green financing. I mean, if you're in the green financing space, you're sort of saying, well, look at the World Bank report on this. Look at the money that's being lost. Maybe let's use these instruments instead. So moving on here, Richard, if you're good with this, let's get into the meat of this sandwich here. We'd like to cover a few topics and take advantage of David's extensive experiences and knowledge about Saudi Arabia. David, let's start with a subject you cover extensively in your book, Vision or Mirage, and that is the rise and reign, of King Salman. We've talked about this a good bit on this podcast, but can you start by elaborating a little bit on the significant and consequential role King Salman has played since becoming king?
Sure. I think it's widely recognized that King Salman has conducted something of a revolution in the social life in Saudi Arabia, and also is trying to do that in the economic life of Saudi Arabia. But people often overlook the revolution that he brought in political matters. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe he wanted people not to focus on that. But the reality is that he totally changed the political structure of Saudi Arabia. And I would argue in the long run made it more stable. The fact is that the system of succession has been, and the fact that Saudi Arabia had a stable and peaceful mechanism for succession was one of the factors that led to stability and prosperity in Saudi Arabia. That model, as you well know, was predicated on transferring power from one son of Ibn Saud to the next. And that system seemed to work quite well. But the problem was that they were running out of sons. They, had been going on for 60 years. I think King Abdullah's, or King Ibn Saud's, King Abdulaziz's first son was born in 1902 or something like that, and his last one was born in 1952. So he was a busy fellow for a long period of time, and he had a lot of sons and daughters. And so we're running out of sons. We now have to move to grandsons. They are, by definition, a much less cohesive group. There are probably 500 of them, as opposed to, 34 sons that were still alive when Ibn Saud died, something like that. And many of those grandsons felt that they were qualified. And so there was a real potential for a Game of Thrones. And I think also, to be fair, that there were a lot of people who thought they should have the job who probably weren't really up to it. So King Salman engineered, quite specifically, quite deliberately, the rise to power of someone he thought would be a good king. And as Ali Shihabi points out, that was an unusual decision in that he abandoned the concept of age. And that had been one of the key characteristics of the royal family politics, is that deference was given to age. Not totally, not that was not the only factor, but it was a major factor. And he skipped many older cousins and even some of his older brothers of Mohammed bin Salman, because he saw in him what he thought he needed to transition into the next generation. So that was I think the first political change that he engineered. And the second that he engineered politically was, if you will, a downsizing, whatever word you want to call it, of the royal family, in the sense that there were thousands, tens of thousands of these princes, all of whom felt that they had some sort of legal prerogative, financial prerogative, claim on the treasury. And he disabused them of that. And I think, again, both of these things were necessary. The first was necessary because you have to have one guy who's going to be a king, and you don't want a civil war. The second was necessary because the population was not permanently going to endure thousands of princes not paying their electric bill, especially when they come and tell you, by the way, your electric bill is going to double this week. So you had to do something to make it appear that that there was not a class. It's sort of like in Britain, I mean, most people in Britain they're quite happy to have the Queen have a very wealthy lifestyle and a very privileged position, but they're not going to let hundreds of members of the royal family, they're not going to pay for them all to live in palaces. So you had to downsize or shrink the number of people who were getting this prerogative. And they did that. And they stabilized, as I say, the succession. And the third thing that he did politically was that he made it clear that corruption was not going to be acceptable. I think King Salman had always had a dim view of corruption, to the extent that he was able to limit it in Riyadh, where he was in charge. He did. But he was not able to do that throughout the country. And he began to make it clear that he changed the rules, and that was unfair, perhaps you could argue, to some people who had played by an old set of rules which they thought was acceptable, and then all of a sudden woke up one morning and found out the rules had changed. But again, that was something I think that needed to be done, and he did it. So I would say those were the three political things that he did, which are really each one of them quite dramatic and worthwhile in itself.
David, this man, King Salman, is endlessly fascinating to me. And I don't think people really fully understand. I think people, if they read your book or if they're really deeply into it, what a pivotal role he's played. And from the moment he became king in January 2015 to when Mohammed bin Salman was named crown prince in June 2017, that's 30 months. And he simply transformed the whole the whole proposition in so many fundamental ways that you just outlined. He's such a dichotomy. I mean, this is a man who, can trace his royal DNA back for centuries. Has spent, when he arrives as king, he is the ultimate insider, the ultimate benefactor of a system, the bluest of bloods. And yet, and I want to quote something, so that's one side of it. That's his sort of pedigree, that's his lineage, that's his DNA. And then you describe him, quote from your book, he had been governor of Riyadh province for 48 years, intelligent, pragmatic, hardworking, well-organized, and disciplined. He was also strict, demanding, and humorless. He made firm decisions, would become known locally as the king of decisiveness. Salman's long-standing emphasis on effective administration, opposition to corruption, and unforgiving disciplinary style were all well known when he became king. These traits have characterized his reign ever since. So
I think that's accurate. Yeah.
Well, if you were to read this,
I wrote it. I think it's accurate. Yeah.
Well, no, and I certainly believe it.
And I could back it up with many examples.
I don't know who writes this stuff, but I'm just pulling it out. But no, this is. I think this is fascinating, and it appears to be spot on. But so, should we have not been surprised?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I wrote that, and I knew all of that, and I was still surprised at the effectiveness with which he did it. So you can take that as an answer. I mean, I was surprised. I didn't. It took me a while to figure out just how bold he was going to be. What he did was really implement something of a revolution, which really, in Saudi terms, it was a revolution. So no, I didn't expect him to be quite the revolutionary that he turned out to be. I expected him to his personality was as I described. And I think that his two principal motivations, and this is true of, I think, of all the senior princes, they have a binary goal, and they see the two as very interconnected. One is to preserve the monarchy, and two is to do a good job of providing for security and prosperity for the Saudi people. And they believe and I think actually quite rightly, that preserving the monarchy does in fact enhance the prosperity and security of the Saudi people. So, but it's not a purely selfish thing that when they say we need to preserve the monarchy. If you look around and see what happens to most Arab countries when the monarchy collapses, it's not a very pretty picture. So I think they're right about that. So it's they're helping themselves, but also helping the country at the same time. And I think that was his clear motivation. And he was pretty radical about how he went about doing it. So yeah, I was a little surprised. I was a little surprised at the speed at which he did it. Yeah.
I don't know how one couldn't be. Just stunning, really. Throughout history, there's always the endless question about, does the moment make the man, or does the man make the moment? And I've said on this show a number of times that November 2014 OPEC meeting, when Saudi Arabia declined to decrease production as oil prices were declining rapidly as a result of U.S. shale oil production skyrocketing. And sort of looking into the abyss going forward, going, okay, we are no longer, this revenue model is not going to work. And we have to find some other way to do what the two things you just noted, preserve the monarchy and provide for the people. And so that's November 2014. King Salman becomes king in 2015. And it's fascinating to me that he already had this mindset. He already had this approach, this sense, this deep, deep, deep understanding of what didn't work and what might work in the traditional ruling system, along with this really financial, existential imperative to do something different if you want to survive. And it just feels like at that juncture, in the end of 2014, after 3 years of oil prices over $100, it was going to end up by the middle of 2015, it was at $29. 2015 and 2016, terrible revenue years. They simply didn't have the money to take care of their people. They had to do something different. It just seems that juncture was extremely.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think that the fact that the country was bleeding reserves certainly gave impetus to some of the changes, and it gave him an argument that he could use when he had to impose those prices on people. The Saudi people are astute. They know very well that their lifestyle depends on the price, or people say the price. It's not really the price, it's the revenues, and revenue is a value which comes from both price and quantity, but people like to use price. So in any event, they're not ignorant of that fact. And so they could see that things needed to change. And so it allowed him to make some of the changes, which in the long term he recognized needed to be made.
By the way, in terms of King Salman, the man or the moment, I think the man met the moment.
Yes, he did. I think, at that time ought to make him man of the year in some ways. I mean, because he really did, and as he grows older and his son becomes more experienced, it's inevitable that his son will assume more authority. But for sure, in 2015, when Mohammed bin Salman was the newly appointed defense minister, he was not running the country. This is something that always troubles me a little bit when people blame Mohammed bin Salman for the war in Yemen, which I find almost laughable when people say that, because the king was the king. There was a crown prince, there was a deputy crown prince, there was Saud al-Faisal, ill but still alive, at the foreign ministry. The idea that Mohammed bin Salman just walked in and said that we're going to war, and I don't care what anybody else says, I mean, that's just crazy. And plus, they were already thinking about it under the days of King Abdullah. Mm-hmm. I feel that to some extent, MBS gets unfairly abused in the media for that, at least.
On the Yemen issue.
Yeah, on the Yemen issue. I mean, I think on a number of things about the Yemen issue. I mean, first of all, we were not willing to let the Soviets put missiles in Cuba. So why should the Saudis be willing to let the Iranians put missiles in Yemen? The Yemen is the soft underbelly of Saudi Arabia. The Egyptians under Nasser tried to destabilize Saudi Arabia through Yemen, and now the Iranians are doing the same. Which isn't to say that there aren't internal issues that are purely Yemeni. That's certainly true. But I think if there were purely Yemeni involvement, if there were no Iranian involvement, the Saudi attitude toward what's going on in Yemen would be very different. Mm-hmm. And I also find it interesting that nobody seems terribly worried about the human catastrophe in Syria. We hear almost daily about the disaster in Yemen, but I think if you look at the number of people, there's probably more people have suffered in the civil war in Syria.
David, could you briefly characterize each stakeholder group that you discuss in your book and sort of talk? Your book was published in September 2020, and a lot has happened in Saudi Arabia since then. Could you maybe update, briefly characterize each stakeholder group, and then maybe, I guess, update sort of the five stakeholders since the date of your publishing?
Yeah, I don't think that anything really dramatic has changed in what I said. There have been more examples of trends that were already happening in 2020, the end of or basically, let's say January 2021. So in the last year and a half now.
David, can I interrupt just for a second? Sorry, just for our listeners and viewers, the five stakeholders that David assessed and analyzed were the tribes, the clerics, the merchants, the technocrats, and the royal family.
Mm-hmm.
The tribes are probably the least affected. And as I said in the book, the reason the tribes have been a key part of stability in Saudi Arabia, they are becoming less powerful. That's not so much because of anything that the government did or that Vision 2030 changed, but it is a result simply of a society that's modernizing, and tribal structures become less important. Certainly in rural areas, they remain important, but in urban areas where there's people from many different tribes and groups, it's become less important. I think it would become more important again if security ever became a problem. I think then people would go back to their tribes, but at the moment, that's not the case. So the tribes have not been affected that much, except what their natural erosion of what's happening as a society modernizes. The clerics, certainly they have been impacted by the change. Their status and power and influence has been openly reduced. The religious police have had their fangs pulled, if that's a word we want to use. And their ability to dictate social mores has largely evaporated. Now they have the senior clergy have continued to be consulted, and they have continued to endorse most of these changes, and so they have remained well funded. They have not been challenged in terms of the perks, if you will, that they get, and so they remain loyal. The senior clerics and most of the clerics, I think, who in one way or another are civil servants, remain loyal to the regime. I think the question is, if the country began to suffer economically, seriously, and there became voices of dissent, they would be expressed in Islamic terms and religious terms. The Islam religion is the mechanism, the political mechanism for dissent in most Arab countries today. And so then you would see what you have seen in the past occasionally, a division within the religious establishment, and that there would be people who were more radical and people who were less radical. And there are people who are more radical today, but most of them are in jail. So, and I think that was deliberate. I mean, they have put people who opposed change vociferously and vocally in jail, and this is people who are extremists on both the left and right. I think it must make for an interesting prison lunch table to see some of these radical liberals talking to the radical Salafis, or whatever you want to call them, sororities. So I think that the religious people have seen their influence reduced, but they are not going to rock the boat, because at the end of the day, they are wedded to the regime. That's the senior clerics. And they still have influence. It's not that they have been totally, I wouldn't want people to have the impression that they've been totally swept aside. They still have considerable influence in courts and in schools. And they don't want to lose that. So that's the next group is the merchants. What the merchants want most is stability. You can't, they say capitalism is a coward or cash is a coward. Yeah, that's right. So what they want ultimately is a stable government. And I think that they see King Salman and his son having taken steps to ensure stability. So at the end of the day, they're happy about that. They're not happy about the change in their business model. And what do I mean by that? Well, some of the things that they have counted on as subsidies have gone away. They have had to start paying taxes, which they didn't used to have to pay. They've been encouraged to hire Saudis who are more expensive and sometimes less efficient than the docile foreign workers that they were able to employ for a long time. So in many ways, their business model has changed to their detriment. And it's probably not as easy to get a government contract as it once was. But on the other hand, many average businessmen that I have spoken with are happy about the fact that there's less corruption. That's a good thing. If you're not the guy who's connected and paying the bribes and getting all the contracts, and all of a sudden there's a fair bid and you don't have to pay any bribes, and you have a chance at getting a contract which you didn't even bother trying for in the past, that's a good thing. And so I think that in general, most of the businessmen are never happy when oil prices are down. So during the COVID time, the economy slowed down. And that was a problem for business. And that was a problem for small businesses everywhere in the world. So to that extent, I think that many businesses in Saudi Arabia have suffered and have felt the pain and have gone out of business. But I think that realistically, they would have to accept that that is as much a result of COVID in the last 2 years as it was of the king and his economic policies. And I think we're seeing now recovery from that, which we should see for the next couple of years. And right now, I said in the book, if oil goes to $20 a barrel and stays there, Vision 2030 is not going to work, and people are going to say that all the consultants wasted our money. If oil prices get to 100 and stay there, Vision 2030 is going to look like a brilliant plan. So oil price still matters to the economy, and that is the case for the businessmen. I would think that in the next year or so, they're going to be happier than they've been in the last 2 years. Technocrats. Most people in Saudi Arabia are technocrats in one way or another, a civil servant of some degree, and they have seen their life change in a number of ways. For one, you can't be sure that you're going to get a job in the government anymore. So if you were a Saudi who had always counted on getting a job in the government, not doing too much work and getting a reasonable salary, that's not good. You're not happy about that. If you are a Saudi in government employee, you have seen some of your benefits cut. You have, I don't think they've gotten a raise to keep up with the growing inflation this year. And they're being asked to do more work, and now you can be fired if you don't do a good job. So on one hand, those are negative things, but then there are positive things too. And Lyndon Johnson used to say he wanted a one-armed economist because they always told him on one hand and then on the other hand, right? So I'm guilty of that today. But it's true that to the extent that, yes, some Saudi bureaucrats are unhappy because you can now get fired and you now have to actually show up on time and do some work. And this varies from ministry to ministry, but in general, that's a trend. On the other hand, you talk to some Saudi, let's take a dentist. This is a real example, a dentist who works in a government hospital. Well, before, all the dentists got paid the same, whether you saw 5 patients or you saw 15 in one day. All dentists got paid the same. Now they pay you a little bit extra for seeing more patients. So the ones that work hard, they're happy. The ones who want to drink tea all day, they're not happy. So I would argue that, like as I said in the business community, some are happy because they got stability. Others see their business model being eroded. Um, so there are, and to be fair, probably some people have both opinions at the same time. So and then to take a look at the royal family, well, we talked about them already to a considerable extent, but I think again, their perks have been substantially reduced, but they are still princes in a monarchy. And that's better than being in exile in Monaco. So, the monarchy is being preserved, and I think most of them recognize that and are happy about that. And I think that my own take on this is that any opposition that was in the royal family to the succession of the crown prince has largely, if not completely, evaporated. So I don't think there's going to be a succession war or problem now, because people, partly because they have demonstrated that they're going to be able to preserve the monarchy, but also because the monarchy has reached out to pretty much all branches of the family and given them a stake in the system again. So they haven't ignored these people. I can tell you, I remembered very clearly. You asked me if I was surprised. I remember very clearly where I was when the penny dropped and I realized that they were going to sack Mohammed bin Nayef, and because that was not obvious. That was not obvious for a while. And I read the newspaper. I was sitting in the Four Seasons having lunch, and I saw a list of all the new deputy governors. There was like 15 of them or something like that. And I looked at that and I read that and I thought, wow, that's it. He's rounding up votes. And that's exactly what they did. And they lined up and everybody got something. And all the people that were going to have a vote at this informal committee, which was supposed to be formal, but really didn't meet formally, this Baya committee, every branch of that family got something. They either were a governor or a deputy governor, an ambassador to some important place. So he took care of the princes. And he's even brought in princes from, disparate, not disparate, but distant branches of the family. So I don't see them as rocking the boat. So I guess what I'm saying is that all of these groups have been influenced in some negative way by the changes. But in each case, the overwhelming balance of their interests is still very much to stick with the regime, especially if you look at what the alternatives might be.
So many questions coming in. I'm going to try and limit it to two. The first one, you referenced earlier that you thought the net result, the result of King Salman's steps and the measures he's taken since January 2015 has resulted in a kingdom that is more stable. Why do you think that?
Is it more stable today or is it less stable today? Actually, I think there was a period when it might have been less stable, because things are changing very fast and very dramatically. And when anything that's changing fast and rapidly is by definition almost less stable than something that's static. So, but I also think that at some point in time, had they not made these changes, it would have become unstable. So I don't know if you've ever seen a book by Ian Bremmer called The J Curve. It's a good book, and it's an interesting concept about the openness in a society. And what he would argue is that as a society becomes more open, it becomes less stable. And then because of its openness, over time, it goes down and then it goes up and you make the J and it becomes more stable. I think that something like that is what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia in terms of stability. that they probably went through a period where it was less stable, but now that it's going to become more stable in the long run. I don't think it was ever unstable in the sense that there was going to be a coup or a revolution. I don't think it ever reached that point, but I think that there was, nobody really knew who's going to be, and today nobody knows who's going to be who. What would happen if, let's just say, what would happen if something happened to Mohammed bin Salman? Who would be the next king? I don't know. That's a destabilizing thing because you don't know who the next guy would be. Always in the past, we've always known pretty much who the first and second and third person would be. There's no third person today, so that's a little bit destabilizing.
Fascinating, because I agree 100%. Because I think if you're looking out there in January 2015, if you continue business as usual, instability will occur because you can't address the needs of the people based on the model as it had been. I also think I think it's fascinating because there's a little bit of a mini J curve that's occurred since 2015. Because if you look at, I call it the confidence level, and there were some bad years. I mean, MBS was made Crown Prince in 2017. 2017 was not a good year. You had the Qatar diplomatic crisis. You had the Ritz-Carlton detention. You had Saad Hariri was detained. 2018, they introduced the VAT. Controversial. That's a brand new thing. Of course, October 2018, Jamal Khashoggi was killed. A whole nother set of problems. March 2020, COVID pandemic. Right in the middle of that, right in the beginning of that, you have the price war with Russia. And then in July 2020, at the heart of at the early start of the pandemic, they increased VAT 15%. So there's all these crises that are occurring really at the inception of the MBS era as Crown Prince. But you can see as we're coming out, fourth quarter is 6.8% growth, GDP growth. There's a great deal of obviously oil prices are at levels they haven't been since 2014. There's a great deal of confidence, I think, when I watch this government manage its finances and insist that it will stick to these budgets, and this is what we're going to be doing, this is where we're going to be spending money, and offering a sense of predictability to the business class, but also in general sticking with a plan. Obviously the revenues are very helpful. I just see their confidence.
No, I think that all speaks well for the king's decision as to who he wanted his successor to be. There aren't, Tom Friedman said it in one of his articles that, I can't quote it exactly, but he basically said, if you think that there are, a dozen princes in Riyadh who are as aggressive and I think he used the word cunning and determined and ambitious as Mohammed bin Salman, you're wrong. There aren't many people like him. There aren't many people like him in the world, I don't think. And, he is the kind of guy who's getting things done when they need to get done. And he's breaking consensuses, but he's trying to create new consensuses. But you mentioned the question of VAT. That's a very good example. There were a variety of consultants working on that project, some from private sector and some from international organizations. And they were saying that putting VAT in an economy this large is going to take so many months. And Mohammed bin Salman was very adamant. He said, no, this is the date we're going to get it done, and we're going to get it done. And you figure out how to get it done. And they did figure out how to get it done. And they came up with some fairly creative ways to get people to comply. And they made some excuses or some, what do you call it, exceptions for some people who couldn't. But by and large, they got the thing done on time. That was the kind of drive that you needed. And that this, as you say, the Salman MBS team has provided, which is a very positive thing.
Yeah. The second question, and sorry to jump in here, Lucien. The relationship with the clerics has not only been changed internally, but the message going abroad is significantly moderated. And Saudi Arabia's often through the World Muslim League, but other platforms is trying to refashion what it thinks is appropriate and best for Islam globally, and a much more moderate approach. Have you seen that? And I'm sure you've seen it, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for the rest of the world, that's one of the most important things that needs to be recognized, that needs to be celebrated and needs to be appreciated. And I think we cut off our nose to spite our face to continue to think of the Saudis as a pariah state, which some people have said. I think that's a big mistake. Right now, we should embrace their willingness to change. If you look at the social changes that are happening in Saudi Arabia with relationship to the role of women, I mean, we could talk about that for a very long time, but the end of the guardianship rules, the end of gender segregation in the workplace, the opportunities that are now aggressively being promoted for women, all this is happening in a country where we don't spend any money on foreign aid, and we haven't had any Americans killed there fighting in a long time. And you look at this compared to Afghanistan, where how much money do we spend and how many people got killed? And now it's going exactly backwards. So we should be embracing Mohammed bin Salman for what he's achieving. It doesn't mean that I know people are going to say, oh, look at Yemen and look at Jamal Khashoggi. I don't want to ignore those things, but I think they have to be put into a balance. And as you pointed out, the fact that they are now actively promoting, well, number one, they've stopped sending money to certain institutions that were, perhaps you would call them, intolerant. I think that's probably the best word to use. And they've started promoting a more tolerant view of Islam. And the fact that the head of the Muslim World League, went to the commemoration ceremony at Auschwitz is pretty indicative of a radical change in the way that they look at the world, and I think the way they want the world to look at them.
I think you're referencing it, but not only they not supporting intolerant, they're really clamped down on the ability of private citizens in the private sector to support or to move any money to these groups.
I think, look, a lot of that was, I think, and I've dealt a lot with that in my time as economic counselor. I'm sure there were some people that knew that their money was going to some nefarious purpose. But I saw a lot of people who thought they were giving money to United Way or the Red Cross or the Red Crescent or some guy would come. I saw this with my own eyes. Some guy would come and say, oh, give me money. I'm going to go build a mosque, or I'm going to go build an orphanage. And they would say, okay, and they'd write him a check. But who ever knew what that guy did with the money?
Right.
Or what he did with, 10 cents on a dollar. So it was a very difficult and uncontrolled. I would imagine if you looked at charities in the United States in 1900, they were probably not very well regulated either. That's changed. That has changed dramatically. So now charities especially charities that are sending money overseas, are very tightly controlled.
Right.
Does that mean that if you want to send money to some bad guys, that you cannot do it? No, it doesn't, because that's something that you should understand, is that there are many wealthy Saudis who have bank accounts in London or Paris. How can the Saudi government stop them from doing something with their bank account in London? Not really. Right. Not any more than the U.S. government can stop me from doing stuff with my bank account in London, although they actually have a form I have to fill out to tell them about it.
They do, isn't it? Yeah, and a lot of people are upset about that, and well, it's incredibly intrusive. And foreign countries should feel the same way too, and foreign banks.
And the other thing is that there's still a lot of it's getting less, but there's still a lot of cash transactions in Saudi Arabia. And there is something which most of the people listening to this ought to understand, which is the Hawala system, which is almost impossible to track that. So if you want to get money to terrorists, it's kind of like, do you want to smuggle drugs into the United States? Well, there's plenty of people trying to stop you, but you have a chance of getting through even if you try. And I think that's still the case with people trying to get money to terrorists.
I think you're right. It's massively reduced, and the whole message, the whole mechanism has changed in Saudi Arabia. And I agree, it's an overlooked good that benefits us all. That Saudi Arabia has just changed its stance on this.
We could, and I hate to be the timekeeper here, but if you guys are ready, we could move on to our final segment. Richard, unless you have one follow-up question.
No, before we do that, I have to get David to promise to come back and be with us at some point, because we haven't gotten anywhere near the breadth.
Well, I think I might have to promise to talk more succinctly.
No, it's not you. But yes, let's move on to Yallah for sure.
Let's move on to Yallah, yes. So our final segment here. And Richard, actually, would you like to just get us kicked off?
I will. Let me find out where we are here. Yallah, number one. Yallah, Saudi in a minute. Unfortunately, it's not a minute, but we're
nothing
better.
We do is short-winded. That's okay. It's a podcast.
1. Authorities in Saudi Arabia released the new logo for the recently established Founding Day, a national holiday to be celebrated annually on February 22nd, commemorating the kingdom's founding in 1727 by Imam Muhammad bin Saud. The phrase Foundation Day 1727 AD is written below the logo, which is made up of 5 symbols: the flag, dates, the Majlis, the Arabian horse, and the market.
The logo is really, really cool. It's sort of, it looks like a vintage stamp, right, Richard? It's like
I love it.
It's cool. Yeah. David, any thoughts?
My thoughts. No, I haven't really given that much thought. I honestly haven't. I mean, I think it's an interesting concept in a number of ways, in that, that the idea of National Day was frowned upon for a long time, that it was considered to be a non-Islamic holiday and that you weren't supposed to have it. That is, again, a change in attitude towards religious dictates. Now, it was a few years ago, they decided to celebrate National Day, which is the unification, if you will, of different parts of Saudi Arabia. And now they're actually, and I always wondered why they didn't have something to celebrate the founding of the whole operation, if you will, the whole dynasty. So now they're doing that. I think, I don't have a particular view as to whether it's good or bad. I hadn't thought about that. I think it's probably a good thing. Gives people more reason to feel proud of being a Saudi.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, on the logo, so often, graphic design firms and public relation firms, get paid outrageous amounts of money for not much. But whoever did this, I think, did a good job, because it's very striking and an interesting way to portray it. Anybody who listens to the podcast, last week anyway, I sort of expanded on Founding Day. I find it endlessly fascinating, and I was talking about the distinction between a country and a nation, and between the National Day, which was established 2005, and now the Founding Day. One of the primary differences is a nation has a founding myth or a narrative. And it's just really interesting with Saudi Arabia as it goes about formalizing this founding myth. So I think this Founding Day is really an interesting step.
February 22nd.
I think, the more, if I add something to it, I think that what it does, it enhances the legitimacy of the monarchy by demonstrating and reminding people. In the book, I talked about different reasons for Saudi Arabia to be stable. One was a balancing of the stakeholders, which we talked about. Another was a smooth succession, which we talked about. And another one was the historic legitimacy that the family has for having created the place. And I mentioned in the book that was, to some extent, a waning asset, because people were forgetting about that. And I think this is actually, now that I think about it, I think it's a bright idea, because it's going to remind people that this family has been supervising, ruling, whatever you want to call it, governing that part of Arabia for, since before there was an American republic. So I think that's actually a good idea. I think actually, more I think about it, it was a clever idea.
And David's book is Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. For those of you who are watching this in segments on YouTube, just want to make sure that you guys know that. Let's move on to the second Yallah topic today, Richard. Organizers for the upcoming World Defense Show in Riyadh said they have sold out all of its pavilions as the kingdom gears up to host its first major defense and security event of its kind in Saudi Arabia. On March 5th, as a precursor to the inaugural World Defense Show, the first ever Riyadh Defense Forum will be conducted by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The World Defense Show will kick off the first day with a, quote, spectacular opening ceremony featuring live demonstrations of interoperable defense capabilities across all key domains. I bet that is something to behold. Just very interesting. That's coming up on March 5th.
And then I guess the actual exhibition is from the 6th to the 9th. So, and it looks like 450 firms from 37 countries will be there. Of course they want to be there. And this is all put together by the General Authority for Military Industries, GAMI.
This has been in the works for like 2 years at least. They've been gearing up for this. So I think this is going to be quite the spectacle.
Yeah, and this is a dedicated space. They built, I guess this is all purpose built, where the exhibit is going to be shown.
Yeah, wow.
Interesting. Number 3, U.S. Central Command head General Kenneth F. McKenzie said there is a rare opportunity to integrate air missile defense in the Gulf region, according to a report from AirForceMag.com. McKenzie noted that Iran, quote, remains the central threat around which U.S. Central Command is organized, unquote. McKenzie conceded that the goal of integrated air and missile defense for the GCC states has foundered to date. I thought this was interesting in the sense that it was sort of based on the U.S. would like to see this happen. It's also interesting in the context of general GCC concern about where the U.S. is headed in terms of its commitment to the region, security commitments, defense. But he did note what he said. He said 2 things that I thought were interesting. Again, this is from a U.S. perspective. He said, this discussion is possible for a number of reasons. One is it's sort of generally the region's concerned about Iran, and especially its missile and nuclear intent capabilities, rather, and that with Qatar back in the fold, it couldn't be done without Qatar because of their key situation geographically, and also, of course, they have significant defense assets in Al Udeid and other things. But he also mentioned that also because Israel is now in the Central Command. It was recently moved from the European Command to the Central Command. So I guess in his mind, he's saying, all right, we have more assets now if we wanted to get some sort of GCC integrated defense mechanism, we have more assets to bring into bear. But I just thought it was interesting.
Number 4, Richard, the Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, the PIF, which we never talk about ever on this show, has been assigned debut credit ratings by Fitch and Moody's, receiving an A and A1 rating respectively. The PIF is looking to extend credit facilities and raise public debt to fund its ambitious spending and investment commitments at home and abroad, according to the Financial Times. As the key policy-driven economic agent of Saudi Arabia, Fitch does not expect changes to PIF's status, ownership, and control over the medium term, which is an interesting thing for them to have to say. That's good for the PIF, very interesting.
Well, as you say, PIF is sort of the linchpin of so many things that are trying to be accomplished with Vision 2030. External investment, internal investment, the vehicle to bring public companies into a private sector or to list them on the Tadawul. So yeah, it's good to know they're financially sound. Number 5, Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Human Resources and Social Development has approved the introduction of work from home in the government sector. The ministry's approval of telework as a new method of work in the government sector is part of achieving diversification and ensuring continuity of jobs in various work environments. I thought this was interesting, especially in conjunction in our daily review today, Saudi U.S. Trade Group Daily Review. One of the topics we cited was a grievance from 5 women about arbitrary dismissal, and between telework and aggrieved employees, Saudi Arabia is getting oh so modern.
Paternity leave is next. Richard, we were ahead of the curve on this, so. Number 6, and we'll wrap it up with this. The Richard Mill, is it Mill or Richard Milley?
Well, yeah.
That just shows how little we know
I'm
about
so glad.
Jeff.
I love it when you get these.
That just shows how unfamiliar we are with the world of polo. But the Richard Mill, and I may correct that, Al Ula Desert Polo 2022 is set to become the first modern polo tournament in the world to be staged in the desert, taking place on February 11th through 12th. It's organized by the Royal Commission for Al Ula in partnership with the Saudi Polo Federation and Richard Mill. The event marks the second season of the two-day tournament, first introduced by the RCU in 2020. The photos of this event look incredible. It's a huge polo field right next to Elephant Rock in Al Ula. It really is an image of how Saudi Arabia has completely changed, and yet in some ways
They're playing on grass. I haven't seen this. Are they playing
sand?
They're playing on sand.
Sand, yeah.
Which has got to change the game.
I was going to say that must change the game a lot. Yeah, interesting.
Well, but this is also, David, we talk frequently about the concept of sports washing, and we also regularly make the point that so much of what Saudi Arabia does internationally in terms of purchasing, soccer teams, football teams, or hosting, controversial golf tournaments or this or that, has a corresponding use back home in terms of Vision 2030 and quality of life and athletic participation. So, in terms of soccer.
I would argue that if you really think that the reason they're doing all of these rock concerts and magic shows is to please Western audiences or to whitewash their society, you are naive and deceiving yourself. Mm-hmm. These are mostly done for their own domestic audience. They're done to give Saudis something to do, to give them a reason to be excited about the changes that are happening in their life and in their country. They're not done to make somebody write a nice editorial about them in the West. So I find it somewhat snide, if you will, and almost churlish to just say that every time they do something good, there's got to be some nefarious motive behind it. So I think they're having a polo match because they like to play polo. I mean, they have polo matches in Abu Dhabi all the time? Are people saying they're doing that because they want to, what do you call it, sports wash?
Well, that's the common term, and that's the common criticism, and we agree with you.
Well, we agree with you.
Yeah, I think it is a dismissive, not fully informed, and
it's
people
arrogant. It's just arrogant.
I think
it's arrogant, and anyway.
I think it's a good point. I will say that this polo match is sort of a little. It's definitely not open for everyone. Saudi Games approach. Because I looked Richard Mill, whatever it is. That's just a luxury watchmaker, and this is rarefied air. They have a manual winding Bubba Watson model. Bubba Watson just came runner-up in the Saudi International. That'll cost you over $400,000, and they've also recently unveiled a McLaren Speedtail for a cool 1.3 million. If you'd like to wear it, if that's what you want to wear on your wrist, but. Yeah, this is interesting. It'll be beautiful, and the pictures were really, really attractive, as you said. But they're doing so much in Saudi Arabia, and I agree with you, David. People forget, they always apply it here when they say all politics is local. I mean, people forget that for Saudis, what you think, for the most part, in almost every case, it really isn't on their list of priorities of concern. They're thinking about other reasons to do things.
Well, the Saudi government's first priority is its own people. They have important relationships with foreign governments, and they would like to maintain them.
Mr. David Rundell is author of the book Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. Again, we cannot possibly emphasize the importance and significance of this book. It's really, really terrific. Get it. Go get it if you're listening to this. To the Richard Mill people, we will pronounce the name correctly in payment for watches. David, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. It was fun.
Well, I appreciate it. I don't know if you're going to want to have me back with my provocative remarks, but if you do, I'm happy to chat with you.
Well, David, book it. We want you back. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Take care. Bye-bye now.